So welcome back. That's going to stay up there for the day. If you want to take your photos afterwards, please come and get them at the end. But that just, we wanted to start the message because the message today is connection to self. Cath's going to come and join me with her microphone. But the verse that we had was Psalm 139. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. But in that verse, it's very interesting. David asks the Lord to search him. See if there's something within me that is blocking my ability to see maybe how fearfully and wonderfully made we are. And today what Cath and I want to just unpack a little bit is in the area of connection to self, why might we struggle? What areas might we struggle to connect to? So some people found it uncomfortable to have their photo taken. I'm not saying that was a problem. Some people just don't like their photos taken. But sometimes we don't like to look at ourselves. And there could be things in us that is a reason for that. So part of the question today, and it's a reflective message that Cath and I will share, to look a little bit within, because we found a quote a few weeks ago now, and I'm going to read it to you. It's on the screen. Thanks, John. The core battle that rages between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of darkness is over the souls of men. If Satan can tempt us to forget or reject who we are, we become disconnected from ourselves. We want to be fully connected to ourselves, but the reality is we are all made in the image of God. This is the starting point. God knows us, he knows us fully, and he loves us unconditionally. And in our image of God, we have to go back to what God is like. And he is ultimately a relational being. He's got parts as well. He's got bits in him, or people in him, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, that relate to one another. And he's given us that ability to relate to one another in community, but also to relate within ourselves. And we have to actually, so if we are relationally created, like God is, every part of us is designed to work, as in a community designed to work together. There's parts of us that are designed to work, to live in harmony. And the analogy Cath and I were thinking about during the week is a bit like a jazz band or a choir or an orchestra, where it's one orchestra, it's one band, but there's many instruments, or there's many voices in a choir. And those working together bring a wonderful harmony. But when one of those voices or one of those instruments is out of tune, the whole group is in a bit of disharmony or discord. And that happens to all of us. And there's reasons that happen we're going to speak about in just a second. But the call that God gives us is to look at how he sees us, but also how he wants us to reconnect to ourselves in those areas that might be a little bit discordant or grate a little bit within us. There's three significant commandments that Jesus refers to in the Gospels. And the first two we will know well. They're in most of the Gospels. The one in Matthew, Jesus actually quotes these two commandments. In Luke, I think someone comes up to trick him or to ask him a question about what are the greatest commandment. And Jesus says, well, you tell me what they are. But in the one in Matthew, it's actually Jesus who says the first commandment, and he's just quoting the Old Testament, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, or some translations say strength. And the second, just like it, love your neighbour as you love yourself. And then Jesus goes on to say, the whole of the law and the prophets is actually contained in those two commandments. If you're doing that, everything else is in place. He then goes and expands those commandments at the end of his earthly life, and it's only recorded in John's Gospel at the Last Supper, where Jesus says, I'm giving you a new commandment. So the law and the prophets aren't been abolished, and the commandments to love God and love your neighbour, but I'm telling you now, you're to love one another as I have loved you. because he's given us a model that we didn't have until Jesus actually appeared in earthly bodily form. Interestingly though, and this is I suppose what we want to think about a bit today, can we truly love God with all our heart? Let's go back one more, sorry John. Can we truly love God with all our heart if we haven't got all of our heart? Can we truly love our neighbour as we love ourselves if we don't really love ourselves, or we struggle in an area to love ourselves? And can we love one another as Jesus has loved us if we somehow doubt that we're lovable in certain areas? And so that's the question I suppose Cath and I want to pose today, because we need to have ourselves fully to be able to give and receive love. So if a person is matured or established in love, they will be able to give and receive love. But to receive love means we must feel safe to be in need, to be vulnerable, because we'll disconnect from any part of us that is not honoured.
Just let that sit for a minute. The need to be vulnerable and the need to feel safe is really significant. And if when we were young we weren't able to express our needs or express ourself, our true self, our authentic self, and have that honoured, heard, supported, resourced, believed in, celebrated, delighted, you look at these children and we are all swooning over them. They bring us so much joy, and they're learning from this community that I belong, that I matter, that people like me. And this is how we learn to be loved, by other people looking at us. We can't learn to love ourselves in a vacuum. So we experience love first. Jesus says, you know, you are loved because I loved you. And we show that to each other in community. And then when we know in our heart that we're loved, we're able to show ourselves fully. And the glory of God is a man fully alive. And he created us to be fully open and fully alive and fully awake. But what happens is we get traumatized, we get hurt, and we get tempted to shut ourselves down and hide if we are not fully accepted and known. So the need for safety and the need to be vulnerable and the need to be in need, to have needs and to say I need help or I need support, is really essential for growing into the fullness of who God's created us to be. Not everybody had that in place, and so if that's the case and you struggle with yourself or to be with yourself or to like yourself or to know you're loved, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. There's just some deficits that need to be filled up. And that's what we get to do for one another in community, to fill up those places in one another. Can't be done outside a community, and it can't be done alone, really. So the next slide is, what might a disconnected person look like, or a disconnected self look like? We're also very aware that this is a very deep conversation. And psychologists and counsellors swim in this area. That is not who we are. We're just taking a very light look at this today, but this journey within can be quite complex and quite traumatic and quite a torment for some people, and that some people, many of us, need help to unpack that. But just today, just to take a look, if you're not connected to yourself, here are just some of the things that you might experience. I just want to pull up a few of them. Apathetic is a big one. Apathy. You hear people say, I just feel very apathetic, or the community or the church community is apathetic. There's like no life. We're sitting on the sidelines. We're not engaged. Life is too much. Life is too overwhelming. Or there's been trauma that hasn't been resolved, and so we pull back. Our heart just kind of steps back because what's happened has just been too much for us, and there may be unresolved unforgiveness or bitterness toward some event that has happened, toward a relationship or toward a community, and you think, not safe for me to be vulnerable here, not safe for me to put my full self forward. So I'm just going to step back to protect myself. But in the stepping back, we also step back from the life of the relationship or the life of the community, and we disengage. The apathy comes then as a disconnect from ourself as well, because our emotions can be hurt, our feelings can be hurt, our voice can get hurt, our value can be hurt, can feel hurt, and so then we can cut ourselves off from that as well, because internally it's too painful to be me in this space. So to stop myself hurting internally and externally, I'm just going to step back. And then apathy sets in. So when you have apathy happening, or if that's in the community or in ourselves or in our relationships, it's a really big red flag to say, what's happened to me that I'm not turning up, I'm not engaging, I'm not being present here in these relationships, or even within myself, because it's too painful. And that's a sign, one of the signs. I just wanted to pull that. Some people feel numb and disengaged, distracted. They all sort of go with apathy. Depressed, indecisive, unable to make a decision. A lot of people struggle with making decisions, because what if I make the wrong one? And if I make the wrong one, somebody might not like my decision, and then I might get rejected or get in trouble. So they're not confident to make decisions for themselves. Lack of boundaries. Lack of a voice, because their voice might have been dishonoured or not heard, so they don't believe their voice matters. They're chaotic. Independent is a big one. Independence is, I'm going to do it my way, and I'm going to do what's best for me because I can't trust anybody else to look after me. So I will self-refer. And we're not made to be independent. That's the sin of the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve chose independence of God. We're meant to be interdependent, where we allow others to care for us, to speak in, to hold place for us, but we also take responsibility for ourselves and our choices. And then we have an epidemic of self-hate, self-harm, self-rejection, self-sabotage, because there's so much trauma. And some people turn their anger at themselves inward, and that can lead to suicide. That's the ultimate self-hatred event, is I do not like myself, I will take my life. It's no point living. That's the ultimate disconnect from self. And murder is anger expressed outward. You've hurt me, but it's unresolved, so I'm going to hurt you.
I don't know if you have noticed, it's right in the media now about domestic violence, and even overnight that terrible tragedy in Perth, and then others where there's been murder-suicides in families. The politicians are jumping up and down correctly and saying there's something wrong, but introducing programs into schools is not going to... It's dealing with the disconnected, broken selves in our community that leads to these, because ultimately all relationships flow from a healthy connection to self. So if we're not connected to ourself, we do not have ourself to give in relationships. And as Cath was saying, the fruit of that is all over society at the moment. So the question is really...
Sorry, can I just go back?
Yep.
This is a really important one. I just want to mention on the slide before, a seared conscience, because we've all been given a conscience, which is the ability to do the right thing, or a moral conscience. And then we have the laws of God, and we have, the ways God's made us to live well. But a seared conscience can happen, just so that you can understand people. Sometimes people do things and you think, what the heck did they do that for? Like, they should know better, they're a Christian, or they, and you think, why are they doing that? It's not because they're a bad person. It's because there's unmet need. Something deep in them has not been met, and something hasn't been touched or loved or held, and they have chosen to go and get that need met in a way that's illegitimate. And it's this hunger for connection, for belonging, for love, for being seen. So they might sleep around, they might have an affair, they might, do all these things that people do, and you just think, what the? But it is often that they've had to shut their conscience down because they need that thing. And when we do things like that, we can then come back at some point and hate ourselves for it, or reject ourselves for it, or judge ourselves for it really harshly. The enemy comes along and goes, who do you think you are? And really adds to that condemnation. But if we can understand that our needs to be loved, to belong, to be significant, to matter, to be seen and known are so fundamentally important, that when they're not met, we do things that are very unlike ourselves. And Jesus understands that. He has compassion for that. He knows why we go off track and lose the plot and forget ourselves and lose ourselves and go do things that we would not normally do because of the pressure that we're under to be loved and significant.
So we will move on. What might cause us to disconnect from ourselves?
Yeah. Okay. So just really simply, trauma is the main reason why we disconnect from ourselves. And Diane Langberg, who's done a lot of counselling with pastors and leaders and churches, she's a guru. Any of her work on YouTube is brilliant. She looks at religious and spiritual abuse and trauma, all sorts of stuff. But she says that trauma is the mission field of the 21st century. We have an epidemic of trauma. I was just sitting with the Lord a couple of weeks ago and feeling quite overwhelmed by trauma, by the trauma out there, some of my own trauma. And Jesus just showed me this huge throng of people. The line just went on and on and on and on. It was very kind of dark and grey. And as I was looking at them, they were looking down. A lot of them were on their devices. Nobody was connecting. They were all disconnected. Many of them were in pain. Many of them were on the ground, struggling. There was death over this whole huge crowd of traumatised people. And I was just looking at it, feeling quite overwhelmed and asking the Lord, how do we, with what's coming, this tidal wave of trauma which is upon us, how do we as a church, how do we as a people of God, when we have our own trauma, etc., etc. And he just said to me, they just need to look at me. They just need to look into my eyes. And I saw him standing there beside this big, huge throng of people, and he was huge, like you couldn't miss him. He was there, but they couldn't see him, and they were all looking down. And he said all they need to do is look up and look into my eyes, and they will see my love for them, and they will be healed. And it is as simple as that. But it's not simple always to look into Jesus' eyes. Yeah. So trauma, so that was that. Type A and Type B. Type A trauma, and we'll just go to the next screen. Type A trauma is neglect trauma. That's the lack or absence of the good and necessary things that we need. They're essential to grow into a healthy, stable self. Basic stuff, and affection's a big one. We need a lot of love and touch, and to be delighted in and held and fussed over. And type B trauma is the overt trauma. You've got verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. We now have cyber abuse, sexual, psychological, religious, spiritual abuse. The neglect trauma does so much damage, type A. It's subtle. And when you're growing up with neglect trauma, you may not know you're in a traumatised situation, because you don't know any different. This is my normal. I don't have food to eat. I don't have a house to live in. I don't have education. This is my normal. So people that grow up with basic needs not being met don't know any different, but it is still causing their soul trauma because they haven't got the resources they need to flourish and to grow into a stable self. So fear and anxiety come in early, and they think, how am I going to survive in the world? And they build a self that will survive, because I can't be vulnerable. I can't just be in need and my needs will be all met. So neglect trauma is massive. It is abuse trauma, you see it. You actually, it can be your normal as well if that's all you've grown up with and that's all you're used to in the home. But abuse trauma is a lot easier to see, a lot easier to wake up to, and maybe put boundaries up and say, no, I'm not going to tolerate that behaviour. So they're the forms of trauma, basically.
So ultimately, trauma is going to block our ability to love and accept ourselves, but then it'll make it very difficult for us to love and accept others. So what's the result of this trauma in our lives? And there's a word that often is misunderstood and spoken incorrectly, but the word shame has to do with our identity and really identity lives. So when trauma is embedded or seeded into us, the temptation or risk is that it impacts the way that we see or understand ourselves. So we start to think about ourselves not, I did something wrong, but I am wrong. It's not that I made a mistake, but I am a mistake. And we forget that we're fearfully and wonderfully made because we focus in on the things that we believe about ourselves, and it could be what other people have said to us, or it could just be internal, what we think about ourselves. And the problem with that is it does something to us in relationships when we disconnect in those areas. And I was thinking this week, and I put it just in there that it tempts us to disconnect and hide ourselves from ourselves, but also from God and others. And in Genesis 3, where shame first enters, do you remember what Adam said to God? God comes into the garden after they'd gone their own way and made some choices that were not helpful for them. Adam says, I heard you, or we heard you walking in the garden. We were afraid because we were naked, so we hid. And that's what shame actually does to us. It actually disconnects us from ourselves, and the consequence is if we're not connected to ourselves, we disconnect from other people. And it's love that will protect our hearts and give us almost an immunity to shame. And Ephesians 6 talks about being rooted and established in love, in God's love, to know who we really are. There's a really big question. I think we've asked this question before, but Cath's going to ask it again of you.
Yes, that's a really big thing about love protecting us from shame. So being loved well when we're young and growing up and all through life is really essential to help us to flourish. Okay, and where that hasn't happened, that work needs to happen to bring those parts of us back online again where we've disconnected. Who were you before the world told you who you should be? When we come into the world, we have a blueprint that God has put into us like a program. And He knows exactly who He's created us to be, our gifts, our dreams, our ideas, our callings, our personality, our emotions. We come with this blueprint in our spirit, which is eternal. And a little child knows their blueprint. They know it. And as they grow, the role of the parent and the caregivers is to explore, learn, watch, observe that little child and figure out who the heck they are, how they've been designed by God, how they've been created, what gifts they've brought into our world, and how do we get under them and resource them and support them and love them so they can grow and blossom into the fullness of their blueprint. And that's what's meant to happen. But often what happens is the children come in and we think we know who they are or who they should be, and we put rules and ideas and things on top of them, and instead of honouring the person that they are and being curious about the person that they are and saying, well, what the heck, who are you? And I need to learn you and then support you in your growth. And so that blueprint, when it's not honoured, tempts the child to think I'm wrong. They don't see me, they don't know me, they're not seeing my gifts, they're not seeing my dreams, my passions, my ideas. So maybe I'm not who they want me to be. And this is all subconscious, but happens very quickly. And the little child can think, I can't be me here. I'm not safe here. I'm not known here. I'm not seen. I'm not delighted in. I'll just put me away. And it can happen very quick, so sad, and so quickly that a little child's then figuring out then, who are my parents? Who are my family? Who are my community? Who do I need to be for them so they will love me and accept me? And we give ourselves away. It happens all the time at some degree, because no parent and no community is perfect. And we all, every one of us, suffers not being seen and known fully for who we are. Loving attachment's essential to flourish. And, that says it, basically said that. Okay, so what are some of the fundamental parts of us that we may judge as bad, hate, deny, reject, abandon, or give away and disconnect from? So here's just a few. There's so many. We've just picked a few. We'll start with emotions. I'll just go through these quickly. Emotions can be very scary for some people. If your emotions weren't honoured when you were growing up, or you were shamed for having big emotions or sad emotions or fearful emotions or crying, you can tempt to shut them down, because nobody wants to be shamed or told they're weak or told they're bad. So emotions are neutral. If you don't know that, emotions are simply messengers to us of what's right or what's wrong, either happy emotions or negative emotions. But we don't always know that when we're growing up. We can judge all emotions as bad, as scary, as dangerous, because of the trauma that can happen to our emotions and around emotions in the family unit or in the context of school or community. So once we don't feel comfortable with our emotions, we can shut them down. And if we've not been taught how to connect to our emotions, we stay in a state of emotional dysregulation, which is another form of disconnection. And some people don't know how to stop their emotions when they start. Somebody called it emotional haemophilia. It's like there's not a clot on emotions. So you get angry and you're a runaway train and you can't stop your anger and you just hurt everybody in your path, or you hurt yourself internally. Some people are numb. They don't feel. They don't want to feel. They don't feel because it's too painful to feel.
Someone once said to us, just when we were praying with them, that I don't want to cry. They couldn't cry because they said, if I start crying, I don't think I'll be able to stop. There's so much happening inside.
Yeah, they know there's deep pain and disconnect inside, but the only way to heal that is to cry, because there's not just our uncried tears from our unresolved trauma. There's generations of tears. And if our people behind us in our generations were too traumatised and didn't have the skills and the resources and the support to do their healing work, that's down our line, our bloodlines. And the burden bearers, our sensitive spirits, who we are actually, if we're in touch with our heart, we are sensitive and we feel those uncried tears and we suffer from them. And they make our bodies sick. They make us sick. We get sick. The intellect, we can judge our mind as dumb or silly, and then we have difficulties academically, all sorts of things like that. The will is our ability to decide for ourselves. I had one lady come to me one time and she just said, I run on a treadmill 6 hours a day. So I do 3 hours before work and 3 hours after school. She had other issues as well, but this was the one she presented with that we're working on. And she said, I don't want to run 6 hours a day, Cath. She said, I'm exhausted. I don't want to, but I can't stop. And I thought, oh, wow, okay. So I said, well, I don't know the answer, but Jesus does. I said, how about we just ask him to show us? And we went out for coffee. She was sort of a friend, so we went out for coffee. Actually, we were down at Brookside, and she found a pair of shoes she liked, and she rang her mum, and she said, oh, Mum, she said, should I buy the black shoes or the red shoes? And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Didn't think anything more of it. Then we went to Coles, and she rang her husband, and she said, should I buy pork or chicken for myself for dinner? And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So at the time, she was about 26. So I went home, didn't say anything, and the next time we met to pray, I said to her, have you ever submitted your will to somebody at some point in your life? And she said, oh, absolutely. She said, I submitted my will to my mother when I was 3. And I said, okay, tell me more. And she said, my mum was so angry and so critical and so if I did the wrong thing or made the wrong choice, it was just not safe. So I decided I will do whatever mummy says, just to keep her happy. And all her life she did what everybody else told her to do. Totally disconnected from her own power of choice to make decisions for herself, to choose for herself. And it was like a light bulb. And she's like, oh my goodness. And I said, do you know the only person we can submit our will to safely is Jesus? Because he will never dominate it. He will never tell us what to do. He will honour our will. And she was like, oh, I've never had my will. And I said, well, we need to reclaim it and call it back. So we did. And she forgave her mum. And she asked the Lord to recall and reclaim her will and to help her learn to use it again, because it's like a new muscle. She didn't know how. And it was really interesting watching her journey over a couple of years, that coming back online. It took some work. And she was a bit uncomfortable with it. She felt a bit scary using it because the old fear that, it's going to get me in trouble again. But it did come back online and she did submit it to the Lord. And then she had his discernment over it as well to help her make right decisions.
Yeah, that list we're going to come back to shortly. But as you've pondered it, just within yourself, is there something on that list that maybe you've disconnected from for whatever reason? So hold that thought, because the problem is it takes us captive if we in one area don't connect or disconnect from that part of us, it will keep tripping us up, just like that lass that Cath was sharing about. I want to read you a quote here, because when we disconnect from a part of us, it puts us into captivity and we can't actually live from that. And this is a really powerful quote from an old Methodist preacher called E. Stanley Jones about slaveries. So let me read it to you and ponder what he says. Outer slaveries, now he's coming from the 1800s where there probably was still outer slavery happening. There's still slavery happening in the 21st century, by the way, outer slaveries in areas. But outer slaveries are one thing to deal with, but inner slaveries are far worse and crippling. An outer slave can be free inwardly. They can look into themselves. They can escape within, but one who is in bondage within has nowhere to escape. Trying to escape into the without, go out of yourself, only increases and intensifies the inner tangles or torment. He or she is caught, lost and disconnected from themselves and from life. He needs redemption, and Jesus is the only one who can rescue him or herself from themselves. Very powerful. Just this morning I was reading again Luke chapter 4, which was the mandate that Jesus actually shared at the temple, at the synagogue in Nazareth when he's beginning his ministry. He quotes from Isaiah 61, but he picks up the thing and he reads it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news, deliverance for the captives, recovery of sight for the blind, freedom for the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, the goodness of God. That was his mandate, because he says then, he sits down, everybody's going, what's he talking about? And he says, this is fulfilled now. I'm here, this is the mandate. And that's what he calls us to do. People in captivity, but we have to start with ourselves and be willing to look at that. So the question is, how do we go forward? We're going to have communion shortly, but we're going to do what's called an activation. That's just a buzzword around. As we do communion, Cath's going to give you a few ways, and as I said, remember that list that we had, and I'm going to walk around and pass you out a red, well, it looks like a teardrop, but it isn't a teardrop. It could be, and actually maybe that's a good start. It's half of a heart. So I'm going to give you this to hold in your hand. If you want to write on it, you can, but ponder an area. And Cath will say what we're going to do with that. So I'm going to just pass around. That's what you're getting is a teardrop or half a heart, which has been ripped. And then we'll come and have communion together.
Every part of our heart is our dominion. It's been given to us by God. And if we have rejected a part of it or given it away, like my friend did with her will, or hated it or despised it, it's our responsibility to do the work to reclaim that part of our heart. So ask the Lord to show you. We'll just have the next slide, John. Thank you. Again, I just want to say some of this work can go very deep, and if there's something you may need help with from a counsellor or a psychologist, please feel free to go get that help because you're worth it. There's no shame in that. You are worth recovering. Go get someone help sit with you and work out what the heck happened to me. But today what we're just asking is for you to maybe identify some part of you that you don't like about yourself, or you've disconnected, or you don't feel at home with, or you have put aside or given away. And just maybe if you would like to, you may not want to. You still may not want to have that part of you back. It might still be too offensive or too scary. But invite Jesus, if you would like to help you recover this part. If you don't want to invite it back because it's still too traumatizing, maybe you could ask Jesus to just be with that part of you, because he is with every part of us. You remember, Jesus and God is out of time. So we move on with our lives. We forget these parts of us got disconnected and we're left behind in trauma, but Jesus he stays with all of us across our timeline of our story and our life. And if we drop a piece or give it away or cut it up, it's precious to him. He doesn't want the enemy to have one piece of it left in captivity. So he stays with it until we come back and say, oh, wow, I've shed some bits of me that I need to reclaim. And so he's with every part of you, and you can invite him. I know this might sound a bit weird, but you can invite him to just be with your whole system wherever you are, parts of you know about and don't know about, and to hold them safe. Thank him for his loving care and nurture, because he is with you, all of your life. And that's the safety factor. The other thing is I just want to put up, I'm going to play a song while we do communion, and it's quite a powerful song written by a woman who had a lot of dissociation and disconnection, did quite a journey and did a lot of work. But in the end, this is what she came down to, Jesus. And she knew him all through her journey, but the journey was so traumatising. There were many times where she couldn't see him. And praising him and worshipping him and keeping your eyes on him, bowing down and yielding yourself to him so he can help you and heal you. And stay still. When you're on a surgeon's table or when you've got a prickle in your foot, someone will say, just stay still while I get that out. Stay still while I put you back together again. So the staying still is really key to healing. We have to be still. We have to let him put us back together again. And that can be really hard. It can be really hard to do. It might be something we need to learn to do, because staying still can be very scary and painful because it brings up too much. But we have to stay present to that stuff if we're going to heal from it. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of vulnerability. It takes a lot of loving yourself well to stay with the parts of you that are difficult to stay with. But Jesus is with them. And we also sang that song Jen had, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full into his wonderful face, and the things of earth, the things that have hurt us, will grow strangely dim in the light of his wonder and grace. And I sing that song a lot because turning our eyes on Jesus and looking at him can also be very scary. There are still parts of me that struggle to look into Jesus' eyes because it's so intimate and his love is so pure that I find parts of me looking away. I'm still healing. And so those parts of us that struggle, we should be able to see his eyes because we're spiritual beings and his Holy Spirit. So we should be able to see his eyes and look into his eyes in intimacy and see his love for us. But we can have trauma around our eyes where people have glared at us, their eyes have been angry at us, and so our eyesight can be traumatized, and that can affect our ability and our intimacy with Jesus. Makes it hard to look at him because the shame kicks in and we look away. So this is the invitation to allow him to, help you to look up and to look at him with his loving gaze. There's no judgment in his loving eyes, only love.
Okay, so as the song is playing, we're going to come forward and take communion back to our seats and just reflect on the words, reflect on your cut heart, and then I will pray for us. So thanks, God. So come forward to take the elements as the song plays.
You go before I know that you've even gone to win my war. You come back with the head of my enemy. You come back and you call it my victory. Oh, oh. Oh, you go before I know that you've even gone to win my war. Your love becomes my picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You were the defender of my heart. When I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love, and you picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart.
That last verse said, when I thought I lost me, you knew where I'd left me. You reintroduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. And Father, I thank you that we rest on that reality, your ultimate love demonstrated through your ultimate sacrifice for us. And if there's pieces of our heart that are still maybe scattered or disconnected, thank you that you know them. You're not angry or judging us like sometimes we do to ourselves, but you are wooing us. You are calling us back. And as we share a communion time together, remembering you, remembering what you've done for us, we also want to just declare and proclaim that now. And we give you thanks. Amen. So, communion if you need to. So, well, thank you for your sharing. As the team come up, I'm going to read you a quote. It's a little bit of an intro to a book that we're going to be using later in the year from Pastor Keith Farmer. And Cath found this quote 2 weeks ago, and it just sort of makes sense from what we've been sharing today. God's love is an overwhelming force, but it does not bypass or supersede our free wills. The overwhelming power of God's love will transform us, but only if we submit ourselves to him, allowing his Spirit to work within us, being transformed by God's love in an ongoing daily choice that we must make. God's overwhelming love is not like an invading army that conquers us against our will. God does not invade us. He waits for the city gates to be opened from inside by us. He lets us choose whether we want to be transformed or not. This choice is not a one-off, singular event at the moment of conversion. It is a daily choice that one must make every day of our lives, choosing whether we allow God's overwhelming love to transform our attitudes and our actions, or whether we will resist his Spirit, resorting to our disconnected and fragmented heart. It is this cooperation of our wills with God's Spirit that is central to our transformation. Amen. Thanks.